Welcome to the Bookloft Presents a Conversation. Today's guest is the award-winning author of Glass House, whose work you can find in Esquire, the New York Times, and the Los Angeles Times. His new book is The Hospital. Please welcome in Brian Alexander.
Hi, it's great to be back at the Bookloft, sort of, kind of, virtually.
Right. Thank you for taking the time to do this interview. Really, it's really exciting to have this conversation because it's a very vital and important conversation to be having. And I think the book is something that not only, especially with the subject matter of Bryan, Ohio in the book, but also just as a Central Ohio kind of theme, I think it will resonate with not only the customers here in our community, but all throughout the state. And so I'm really glad you took the time to.
I think so. I mean, Bryan really does stand for many communities all over the nation.
Absolutely. And so I think one of the interesting things is when I first picked up the book, obviously with the title such as The Hospital, you're obviously thinking, you're going into it thinking it's about this kind of systemic failure on our healthcare front. But what's really apparent from the first page is that this is a kind of convergence of different systemic failures on a whole host of different issues. And so I wanted to know is, how did you come into this project, and what in your reporting, what are some of the issues and problems that you really wanted to highlight in this book?
Well, thank you for recognizing that, because the book is bigger than the hospital. So for the last 6 years or so, the focus of most of my research and writing has been about inequality, social and economic factors, changes that have been going on in our nation that are reflected in a number of areas. I happen to have been a contributing writer to The Atlantic, and I did a story for The Atlantic about the fragile state of community hospitals, independent community hospitals. For that story, I interviewed a guy named Phil Ennin, who was the CEO of the hospital in Bryan, Ohio. After the story came out, Phil called me up and he said, if you want to know how we are really keeping our doors open, why don't you come to Bryan and I'll show you around the hospital and you can have a look at our community. So I did that. And it occurred to me that I could look at things that were happening in America through the lens of this one small hospital, and not only talk about healthcare, but talk about the social and economic factors that lead people to need healthcare. Why do Americans live shorter lives than people in our peer countries? Why do Americans lead less healthy lives? And it's not just because of healthcare. It has a lot of things to do with the social and economic conditions that they are living in. And I thought, here's a way that I can address that and keep it manageable by focusing on one small town and one small hospital.
Absolutely. And, one of the stories that you talk about in particular, or actually, before we get into that, I wanted to talk about how, because obviously you're talking about Phil Ennin, and he is kind of like, if there is like a principal character in this book, he really embodies kind of like this conflict that's going on within our healthcare system, in which he's trying to, as you say in the book, fulfill the mission statement of the hospital while also running it like a business. And how pervasive is that kind of process, not only in this particular hospital in Bryan, Ohio, but in local hospitals all throughout the country?
That is the fundamental conflict and friction throughout American healthcare. It doesn't matter if it's a big, giant healthcare system or a small local community hospital. That conflict between mission, trying to keep people healthy, alive, thriving, and trying to make a profit is an inherent conflict that we are forcing doctors, labs, clinics, hospitals to navigate every day in our country.
Yeah, and what really, really just captured my attention and surprised me was in some ways how these local hospitals are competing with these giant, like almost kind of like chain style mega hospitals like ProMedica and Parkview, and they're almost kind of employing like these kind of tactics that you would see like your franchise McDonald's and Wendy's kind of employing on like small towns. Can you talk about how we kind of get to this point where we're these kind of like these supposed like healthcare systems are kind of engaging in these kind of like monopolistic kind of tendencies?
And you see it in Central Ohio also. I mean, you have conflicts there, Ohio Health, Mercy. I mean, these giant systems are really trying to corner their market. And this gets to the business aspect. So when you have an oligopoly or a monopoly, you have pricing power because people don't have as much choice. And then what you try to do is you buy up doctors' practices. There's actually now a minority of doctors that have their own independent medical practices. Many of them now have been purchased by big healthcare systems. The same with imaging, labs, and so on. So that's what they mean by a system. It's an all-encompassing, vertically integrated business. And they do that because they feel they have to do that, because they're getting pressure from other healthcare systems that want to move into their territory. They want to dominate. And they have been able to do that. In the case of Bryan, Ohio, as you mentioned, it faces competition from the big health system in Toledo, which is ProMedica, Fort Wayne, Indiana, which is Parkview. Both big systems have coveted that little community hospital and they want to buy it up. And the reason is because they don't want that competition there. And it makes life very difficult. So for example, in Chillicothe, Ohio, the independent community hospital there has faced that pressure and finally succumbed. That was Berger down in Chillicothe. My hometown of Lancaster, Ohio. Fairfield Medical Center is under pressure from the big health systems like Ohio Health, Mercy, OSU, and so on. So this is happening not only all over the state of Ohio, but all over the nation.
And to follow up on that, what is something that I think is really really highlighted in the kind of these battles of systems and things like that. One of the things that really highlights is kind of like how the hospitals are kind of barely getting by. And one of the things that really captured my attention was early on in the book, you're talking about how a lot of these like local businesses barely get a profit. And something to the effect, you're right, that 2/3 of all of the income that Bryan, Ohio gets, in terms of the hospital there, they get it from government dollars.
That's right.
And I think what I'm trying to get at is, you've got like this fight in this country over nationalized healthcare, and you really go into it with the 100-year history of this battle that's been going on, and yet what it seems becomes clear to me in reading this book is that a lot of our local hospitals are subsidized by the government. And so how does that kind of the tension of there, how does that work out? And how does it really, by having this fight, really fail a lot of these like rural, small, local hospitals?
Well, there's a number of factors at play. So Bryan is located in Williams County, way up in the far northwest corner of the state. Very conservative area. It went something close to 70% for Donald Trump in the last election. People are very against socialism, anything that sounds like socialism. But the largest employer in their town is completely dependent on the government for its revenue. 2/3 of its income comes from Medicaid and Medicare. That is not uncommon. The hospital in Lancaster, just south of you, east of you, that gets about 2/3 of its income from Medicaid and Medicare. It's kind of typical for smaller community hospitals. Now, that's actually a problem for them because Medicaid and Medicare reimburse for services at a lower rate than private insurance does, or employer-based insurance. So the wealthier hospitals, these big systems that we just talked about, they might make 6%, 8%, 20%. I talk about one hospital that made 46% margin in Indiana as part of these big health systems because they have all this private insurance reimbursement. Whereas Brian, they feel very lucky if they get a 3% margin, which is basically just enough to keep things open and keep things up to date. And in 2018, they lost money every single month of the year. That's typical for an independent community hospital, just to eke out a bare living from these government reimbursements.
Yeah, and it's really I found it frustrating because you get these kind of government actors, whether it be your local House reps or state reps and state senators, who I believe you talk about later on in the book how a particular state rep is talking about like this need for like faith-based initiative kind of healthcare for the town, and people are just kind of like eating it up. And as a lot of the CEOs and board members are kind of like watching in the background, and they're almost making the argument like, well, if how can you not see that if we do these kind of proposals, you're going to cut and potentially close down the hospital. How does that? It has to be frustrating for you as a reporter, like reading.
Well, yeah, it's totally, yeah. I mean, look, it's really frustrating for, and I'll speak to Ohio specifically here. The last year has been incredibly frustrating for health professionals in the state of Ohio. Ohio has a radically dysfunctional legislature. You saw with what happened with Amy Acton,
Yes.
the director of health in the state of Ohio. That also happened at the county level all over the state. County health departments and the administrators of county health departments were doing the best they could with the little resources that the state of Ohio gives them to try to keep people safe during this pandemic. And you had members of the legislature that were stoking hatred of these people to the point that they routinely received death threats. You had to have sheriff's cars parked outside of their offices because they were afraid of being assaulted. Somebody shot a bullet into Amy Acton's house, into another health administrator's house, I should say. This is, and then you get hospital people, doctors, who sort of can't believe what they're hearing. The episode that you are describing occurred at what was called a drug summit. What to do about the drug problem. Of course, I've written about this before in Ohio, the severity of Ohio's drug problem. And you had a state representative stand up and say, you're never going to do anything about the drug problem until we embrace Jesus Christ. And the county health official who was sitting next to me, his head literally fell to the table. He couldn't believe what he was hearing because he has actually been working with faith-based organizations for over 30 years. And he said, how's that going for us? I mean, have we stopped the drug problem? Because, we want to involve churches and faith-based leaders in this problem, and we do. And we still have a massive drug problem in Ohio, and it's gotten worse during the pandemic. And here you have somebody who's in a position of power saying we can't do anything about it until everybody believes in Jesus Christ and embraces Jesus Christ.
Right. It's incredibly frustrating because you have people who essentially make these, this idea that, government is do nothing, but in actuality, they have the power to do things, but then they don't. They actively sabotage the systems and institutions that they are entrusted and given power to operate. So it has to be incredibly frustrating on that kind of level. And you're talking about the pandemic, and I know that the last part of the book is in relation to the pandemic, and you kind of touched on it, how a lot of these local hospitals are kind of getting by just barely. What were the effects of the shutdown in relation to a lot of these hospitals, and how were they able to either survive, and if not, how many hospitals did we lose, either on a state level or even like a nationwide level, due to the pandemic?
Well, there were, at the beginning of the pandemic, there were about 600 of these community hospitals that were at risk of closing. The hospital in Bryan, Ohio, at the beginning of the pandemic, lost about $800,000 every month. The reason why is because they could not do the non-emergency surgeries, so knee replacements, things like that. And those are revenue generators for that hospital. So they can't do those, but they've still got to maintain the hospital, maintain the emergency room, provide care. So they've got a lot of outflow of expense, but not much income. So they were very, very concerned. Fortunately, Congress passed and Biden signed the CARES Act, which essentially bailed out some of these hospitals. Now, the big systems, like, for example, ProMedica, they had banner years in 2020. Believe it or not, they made more money than they'd ever made. It was a record year because they got CARES Act money and they had so many other services, even without some of these things like knee replacements and so on. So they made out the big systems. In other words, the rich got richer. For Bryan, Ohio's hospital, it was sort of a break-even deal. They were kind of made whole by the CARES Act, so they're okay. But these big systems, they really cashed in.
Frustrating. And then I wanted to talk about also, Phil is not the only person in the book that you write about. You have like a whole host of different people in this community over this time span that you're reporting, and so just incredibly kind, generous people, and then just in some of the most heartbreaking circumstances. And one that really stood out to me was the story of Keith Shehart. Is that how you say it?
Swihart.
Swihart. My apologies. Um, his wife Stephanie, their son Caleb, and their friend Chad Underwood.
Yeah.
Incredibly tragic and incredibly sad, and it's really touched me on a human level. But these are all kinds of different stories that happen in this book. When you're doing your reporting for this, was there a particular case that just really moved you, or just kind of just absolutely floored you?
Well, I mean, I grew to be fairly close to Keith. Keith and I are still in touch. He still is wrestling with his medical problems, and readers will follow his trajectory in the book. There was one particular incident that really did affect me. There's a husband and wife. The wife brings her husband into the emergency room, and he's in a very, very, very bad way. And the doctors and nurses in the emergency room can't believe that she managed to drive him to the emergency room in the state he was in, rather than having an ambulance. And she looked up and said, "I can't afford an ambulance." It would just, it still makes me get a little emotional thinking about it. That shouldn't happen. That shouldn't happen.
Absolutely. It's heartbreaking. And I bring up his wife Stephanie. After everything that happened, to still get laid down with a bill of like $41,000 is, I think, in a country like this, with the amount of wealth density that it has, it's unconscionable and it's unimaginable. And to see these kind of cases happen, not only just in their case, but just all throughout, just this small pocket of Ohio, uh, is baffling and is beyond the pale.
And what that really does is discourages people from going to doctors. And so you get people who do not go to doctors. As one woman in the book tells me about herself and her family, she says, we've got to be dying before we go to a doctor. And unfortunately, in far too many cases, that is literally true. People are literally dying before they finally go see a doctor. There's a reason why the state of Ohio is near the bottom of all 50 states in what's called health value, the health of the population for the amount of money that is spent on health. Ohio ranks almost last, it's like 46th or 47th in health measurements. Ohio is a very unhealthy place. It does not have to be that way. There was a time, and I talk about this in the book, when Ohio was really quite progressive. And I don't necessarily mean that in our current political sense. I mean, Ohio financed and built great state universities and private universities also. Towns built hospitals. They felt that having good medical care for their people was a sign of progress, which is what I mean by progressive. Ohio invested in schools, hospitals, community services, infrastructure, roads. Ohio has been starving itself for the last 30 years, and you now see this all over the state.
I know that you, as a reporter, you like keeping your reporter hat on. You make it very clear to anyone you speak to you about these kind of issues that you're not a policymaker.
No.
But I would like you to put on a policymaker hat for just a second. As someone who has spent so much time researching and reporting on these issues, if you were given the chance to completely put together a healthcare system, what do you think would be one that is equitable and gives people quality healthcare in this country?
Well, we've been arguing about this thing for over 100 years, as I discuss in the book, and I give some of that history. I am a reporter. I am not a policy guy. I will say that, in my opinion, we should actually just blow up the system that we have now, which is not really even a system. As one person in the book sort of almost shouts at me, we don't have a system in this country. I will say that there are other models out there. Other countries do this better than we do. And you could choose among them: Canada, the UK, Switzerland, which is kind of a hybrid government insurance model, the Scandinavian countries. Everybody has a slightly different way that they go about this, but they all do it better than we do. Their people live longer, they live healthier, they spend less money on healthcare. Oh, the United States spends orders of magnitude more per person in healthcare than any other nation on the face of the earth, and we get less results for that. So there are models out there. It should not be that difficult to adapt a model to the people in this country. And people often say, well, look, our taxes are going to have to go up. And I think that Democrats, for example, should be honest and tell business and people, yes, your taxes will go up to pay for whatever the health system turns out to be. But I would also point out that we are essentially already taxed. Every time you pay your health insurance premium to your insurance company, that's essentially a tax. Every time you pay that deductible, that's essentially a tax. Williams County is a very conservative county. The business owners in that county are generally quite conservative. I asked several of them at different points. And I said, look, I'm the government. I come in and I say, Mr. CEO, business owner, let me make you a proposition. I am going to raise your taxes, but you will not ever have to pay another employee health care premium for any of your workers. I'm going to remove that out. There'd be no administration. And it costs a lot of these small employers in Williams County $300,000, $400,000 a year for their employee health care. What if I were to do that for you? Would you take that deal? And these guys said, in a heartbeat. So I think there's actually more sympathy for some sort of national health plan than is generally recognized. And that's even among conservatives.
Yeah, and something that I did not even think about, and you bring up the point in regards to changing up the system, that I think even the most well-intentioned politicians on the progressive left side of the aisle don't particularly bring up, is how ingrained like the healthcare industry is to the economy, and what exactly that would mean to move to a nationalized healthcare system when you have an industry that is so embedded in healthcare. Can you speak to that and what that would mean for that industry going forward? And
healthcare is the largest part of our gross domestic product. It's the largest part of the American economy. At roughly 19% of the entire economy is healthcare. It's about $4 trillion a year. So if you were to say we're going to have a national health plan, there are going to be disruptions and displacements. People that work in the insurance industry, doctors might make less money than they do now. You have doctors out there making well over $1 million a year, especially if they're in a specialty like orthopedics, for example. They might make less money. Drug companies might make less profit. They'll still be profitable, but they might make a little less profit. So what are shareholders going to think about that? This is why I'm not especially optimistic that we're going to radically alter the way we do healthcare in this country. I think we should, but we have to be honest that it will be disruptive. I think that the pain of creating that disruption is worth the payoff at the end, but it's very difficult to get people to sign up for revolutions.
absolutely. And before we end the interview, I just want to say I'm not going to spoil the last page of the book, but I just want to let you know that I've never had an experience floor me in kind of like sobering kind of way that end scene that you vividly portray in that last page. That is, I think, anyone who reads that will come out of it wanting to blow up the whole thing, because
thank you.
Absolutely floored me.
Thank you.
And,
well, that's, yeah. I appreciate those kind words and that perception. It kind of floored me too.
Well, thank you, Brian Alexander, for taking the time to speak to us today. The book is called The Hospital. We will have a link at the bottom of the video where you can purchase it at bookloft.com. Once again, thank you for taking the time.
Thank you very much, and hi to everybody at the Bookloft.